Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that your entire life saving can't even buy a loaf of bread. This isn't a nightmare. It's the reality millions of Venezuelans faced during one of the most dramatic economic collapses in modern history. Venezuela, a country sitting on the world's largest proven oil reserves, larger than Saudi Arabia's, went from being one of Latin America's wealthiest nations in the 1970s to experiencing an economic catastrophe that forced nearly 8 million people to flee their homeland. How does a nation with such vast natural wealth end up in such dire straits? And what can the rest of the world learn from Venezuela's economic downfall? Today, we are diving deep into the economy of Venezuela, a cautionary tale about oil dependency, political mismanagement, and the devastating consequences of failed economic policy. To understand Venezuela's crisis, we need to go back to better times. In the 1950s through the 1970s, Venezuela was the envy of Latin America. Oil exports fueled rapid development, and Venezuelans enjoyed one of the highest standards of living in the region. The capital, Caracas, was a modern metropolis, and the country had a growing middle class. But this prosperity came with a dangerous vulnerability. Venezuela became almost entirely dependent on oil. By the early 2000s, petroleum accounted for roughly 95% of the country's export earnings. When you put all your eggs in one basket, you are setting yourself up for disaster when the basket breaks. The turning point came with political changes in 1999 when Hugo Chavez came to power, followed by Nicolas Maduro in 2013. Their government implemented socialist economic policies and expanded state control over the economy. When global oil prices crashed in 2014, Venezuela's economy, already weakened by years of mismanagement, went into freefall. According to the IMF, Venezuela's GDP contracted by approximately 75% between 2013 and 2020. To put that in perspective, that's a larger economic collapse than the United States experienced during the Great Depression. This matters not just for Venezuela, but for understanding how economic policy choices can have devastating real world consequences. Venezuela's story perfectly illustrates what economists call the resource curse or Dutch disease, a phenomenon where countries rich in natural resources often experience slower economic growth and development than countries without such resources. Sounds counterintuitive, right? Here's how it works. When oil prices are high, massive amounts of foreign currency flood into the country. This causes the domestic currency to appreciate, making the country's other exports, like agriculture or manufacturing, more expensive and less competitive internationally. Gradually, these non oil sectors decline or disappear entirely. Venezuela fell into this trap completely. During the oil boom years, instead of diversifying the economy, the government increased imports of food and consumer goods. Why grow your own food when oil money can buy it cheaper from abroad? Local industries withered. The country became dependent not just on oil revenues but on imported goods for basic survival. By 2012, Venezuela's manufacturing sector has shrunk to just 14% of GDP, down from over 20% in the 1990s. Agriculture, Once a significant part of the economy, virtually disappeared as a meaningful contributor. When oil prices collapsed from over $100 per barrel in 2014 to below $30 by 2016, Venezuela had no economic cushion to fall back on. The country couldn't produce its own food, couldn't manufacture its own goods, and suddenly couldn't afford to import them either. Now let's talk about one of the most shocking aspects of Venezuela's crisis: hyperinflation. To fund government spending during falling oil revenues, Venezuela's central bank simply printed more money, lots more money. The result? Venezuela experienced an inflation rate of 65,000% in 2018. Yes, you heard that correctly. 65,000%. By 2019, some estimates put inflation even higher at over 1 million%. This is hyperinflation in its most extreme form. What does this mean in practical terms? Imagine going to the grocery store in the morning and a carton of eggs cost 1,000 bolivars. You decide to wait and shop after work. By evening, that same carton cost 1,500 bolivars. This isn't hypothetical. This was daily life in Venezuela. People's life savings evaporated overnight. A middle-class family that had saved for years found their bank account couldn't buy a week's grocery. The minimum wage, which was around $30 per month in 2018, could barely purchase a kilogram of meat. Reports indicated that the average Venezuelan lost 11 kilograms of body weight in 2017 due to food scarcity, a phenomenon local grimly called the Maduro diet. The government's response made things worse. They kept printing money, implemented price controls, and even removed zeros from the currency multiple times. The bolivar went through multiple denominations. In 2018, the government removed 5 zeros, and in 2021, they removed another 6 zeros. It's like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. Here's where we see economic theory meet tragic reality. Facing shortages and inflation, the Venezuelan government implemented strict price controls on basic goods, fixing prices for food, medicine, and other essentials below market rates. In theory, this sounds compassionate, make goods affordable for everyone. In practice, it created disaster. When you force businesses to sell products below their cost of production or importation, basic economics tells us what happens. They stop producing or importing those products. Supermarket shelves emptied. Pharmacies ran out of medicine. According to a 2016 survey, about 85% of medicines were unavailable in the country. People died from treatable conditions because antibiotics and insulin simply were not available. This created massive black markets. If you had connections or money, you could find goods at 10 to 20 times the official price. A box of diapers that officially cost 5 bolivars, if you could find it in a government store, would cost 100 bolivars on the black market. The system essentially punished honest people and rewarded corruption. The government also implemented currency controls, fixing the official exchange rate far below market value. This created a huge gap between the official rate and the black market rate. By 2017, the black market rate was often 100 times higher than the official rate. Let's talk about what all these economic policies mean for real people. Venezuela's crisis has created the largest refugee and migration crisis in Latin American history. By 2024, approximately 7.7 million Venezuelans had fled the country, nearly a quarter of the population. Think about that. 1 in 4 Venezuelans had left their homeland seeking opportunities and basic survival in Colombia, Peru, Chile, Brazil, and beyond. This is comparable in scale to the Syrian refugee crisis, yet it receives far less international attention. Inside Venezuela, the humanitarian situation remains dire. A 2019 study found that 96% of households lived in poverty, with 79% in extreme poverty. Healthcare system has collapsed. A 2018 report indicated that 76% of hospitals lacked reliable water supply and 78% had no basic medical supplies. Child malnutrition has surged. Infrastructure is crumbling. Power outages are routine, sometimes lasting days or weeks. Educated professionals, doctors, engineers, teachers, drive taxis or sell snacks on the street, or more often, they have left the country entirely. This brain drain makes economic recovery even more difficult. Venezuela's crisis isn't happening in isolation. It's complicated by a bitter relationship with the United States. Since the Chavez era, Venezuela has positioned itself as an anti-American voice in Latin America, and the US has responded with increasingly strict economic sanctions. The US implemented sanctions targeting Venezuela's oil industry and financial sector, particularly after 2017, when the Maduro government was accused of undermining democracy. These sanctions, according to some economists, have reduced Venezuela's oil production capacity and limited access to international financing. Here is where it gets complicated. The Venezuelan government blames US sanctions for the economic crisis, calling it economic warfare. Critics argue that Venezuela's economic collapse began before major sanctions were implemented, and that the sanctions primarily target government officials and specific transactions rather than the broader economy. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Venezuela's fundamental economic problems, oil dependency, mismanagement, corruption, hyperinflation, were homegrown, but sanctions have made recovery harder and given the government a convenient external scapegoat. Meanwhile, ordinary Venezuelans suffer the consequences of both failed domestic policies and international pressure. So, what can we learn from Venezuela's economic tragedy? First, economic diversification isn't just smart policy, it's essential for long term stability. Countries that rely heavily on a single commodity, whether oil, minerals, or any other resource, are extraordinarily vulnerable to price shocks. Norway and Saudi Arabia have managed oil wealth more successfully by creating sovereign wealth funds and investing in other sectors. Venezuela did the opposite. Second, there is no escaping basic economic principles. Price controls, currency manipulation, and printing money to cover deficits might seem like quick solutions, but they create distortions that ultimately harm the people they are meant to help. Markets might not be perfect, but completely ignoring market signals leads to shortages, black markets, and economic chaos. Third, Governance matters enormously. Venezuela's crisis isn't just about bad economic policy, it's about corruption, lack of accountability, and political institutions that fail to check power. When institutions are weak, even resource rich countries can squander their wealth. The tragedy of Venezuela is that it was preventable. The warning signs were there for years. Economists, both inside and outside the country, predicted the crisis. But political considerations, ideological commitments, and short term thinking overrode economic reality. Today, Venezuela shows small signs of stabilization. The economy has informally dollarized. People use US dollars for many transactions, which has reduced hyperinflation. The economy showed slight growth in 2022 and 2023 after years of contraction. But recovery remains fragile, and the country faces years, perhaps decades, of rebuilding. The question isn't just whether Venezuela can recover, it's whether other nations will learn from Venezuela's mistakes before making their own. That's the story of Venezuela's economy, a powerful reminder of how quickly prosperity can turn to crisis when economic fundamentals are ignored. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think is the most important lesson from Venezuela's experience? And here is a tougher question. Could similar economic policies lead to crises in other countries today? Are there warning signs we should be watching? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this analysis helpful, please hit that subscribe button and click the bell icon so you don't miss our future videos on global economics and international affairs. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.